Before today's episode, I want to ask for your interest. We'd like to open our Keep It Real episodes up to you, the listener, and have discussions on topics driven by the content of this podcast and our social media. If you're interested, we'd love to hear so by dropping us a message on our Instagram. Our handle is ResilientPPT, ResilientPPT. Thanks. Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. This is Keep It Real number 11. We're going to talk about outputs and strategies is what we're going to title this one. So this initially came about with our students over the summer, physical therapy students, talking about, yes, somebody might be able to perform well and put up good numbers in whatever, sport is or performance task is in a weight room or something like that. But then we talked about what if it looks bad, or what if it's a poor technique, a strategy that might not be good long-term for health purposes or longevity for a career. So we just want to dive into that a little bit. And Trevor, I think you're going to take this one and start with it.
Yeah, I think, thinking about like helping an athlete actually like coming off of a relatively serious injury where they like are physically unable to perform and really aren't even on like the training side of things, where they're working on, more of like the weight room qualities, whether it's strength, speed, power, it doesn't matter what it is. Like our job is to be able to get them healthy enough to be able to kind of get into training to, again, increase their output so they have the ability to like be competitive when they get back on the field. So they have the strength that they need, they have, the power and the speed and kind of more of those like physical output qualities. And that's why a lot of like the return of sport tests are really based upon output measures, because they are objective, and it kind of makes us feel warm and fuzzy when we have like a number like, oh, okay, this number is good. An example of that is like the 3 hop test with like coming off of an ACL. That's like one of the biggest return to sport, clearance tests. And just because somebody has that 80%, equality between limbs or whatever it is, like that doesn't necessarily mean that like the strategy that they're using on their formerly injured limb is the right strategy for them. So they could be using like a longer ground contact time. They could be using a much more hip dominant strategy to achieve that same, 80% triple hop. They could just be doing something a little bit different that will probably expose them when they get back on the field, and it just makes their body absorb it and use stress in a way that's probably not the most efficient for them. That I think is kind of why us as coaches and clinicians, it's like we have to have an eye for that to understand like what is the strategy somebody's using, and is that the best strategy for them and how they move. So I think it's like when we work with an athlete, we have to understand like what outputs do they need to be able to have, but then like what strategies are probably going to be best for them to maintain that output over time to be able to be healthy with it.
Yeah, that's good. And that's where like rehab has to, incorporate like integrated movements and even kind of more isolated type things, the whole isolate and integrate, because a lot of the output tests in rehab return to sport tend to be like, a hop test. But in a hop test, like you said, I mean, you could use more of like a hip strategy to achieve the same output limb to limb. But if you're coming off like a knee surgery, how do you know that you can safely load the knee? Maybe you're still working around the knee. That's why, like, if you have the right, if you sequence your program appropriately, and like for example, like that based on having done certain like isolation quad movements, that athlete has sufficient quad strength to demonstrate like a high output with a strategy that you might think is more appropriate. Then if you go and test them and they have the output that you want, but they use a strategy that you don't think is necessarily desirable, then that it's more of like a motor learning type problem than it is, or maybe just like kind of like a cognitive or like a fear-based issue than it is like they lack strength in their quad. But at least having done that like isolation type movement earlier in the program, that like theoretically they have the quad strength to do what you want. And now you're seeing output and maybe like a less knee dominant strategy. And so they should be theoretically capable of it, but they're not doing it for some reason. And now it allows you to target your intervention more appropriately, but you don't need to go back to square one and develop quad strength because they presumably have it. But the hard part with all this stuff is like, and that's the art of coaching. Like the multi-million-dollar question in sports is, let's assume that somebody isn't hurt, right? They never had any injury history, but they kind of have a really high output. Let's say they, and Greg can speak to this better than the two of us, but like, let's say they throw 105 miles an hour, but in a way that we look at it, we think maybe is putting them more at risk for like an overhead injury or an elbow injury, but they've never gotten hurt. That's kind of where, like as a coach, I mean, if you just say, okay, well, anything this athlete does, we're going to say is good because they have a high output, then what value do you really offer? Like it takes some kind of confidence and courage to take a great athlete and say, like, we're going to change a strategy, even though someone's achieving a high output or has success. But then what if you're wrong? Right. And that's a thing where like we can never do a controlled experiment with an athlete where we like change something and then go back in time and don't change it and see what happens. But if you look at even a really appropriate example now is COVID. Imagine if in February, we said, okay, like we're gonna like shut down the borders. We're not gonna have any kind of like interstate or international travel until, at least in like the US, everything is totally under control, and we're controlling for all the outside variables that could create a pandemic within the United States. People would be like, well, we're not, I don't want to do that. That's insane. You're overreacting. And that's the equivalent of taking a great athlete with a high output and changing a strategy. You'd say, well, you're overreacting. But now, with the hindsight that we have 8 months later, we underreacted severely. We would love to have overreacted in the short term for a few weeks to prevent this catastrophe that's ensued. But here's the problem. If we would have said like, okay, we're going to ban international travel, we're even going to like ban interstate travel for at least a couple of weeks until we can kind of see where this thing is going to go. Because if we were to have done that, there wouldn't have been any pandemic here. There wouldn't have been a COVID spread. We could have easily said, well, that was unnecessary, right? So you can't do that controlled experiment, but hindsight's the only way to know if making that change would have been appropriate. And again, that's why it takes a certain kind of conviction to make a change in a really good athlete who hasn't been hurt. Someone who hasn't been hurt, we could say, okay, well, you were hurt, so we're going to change things. And that athlete and the sport coaches are going to be a lot more receptive because we have that. It's easy to get buy-in when you could say, oh, well, you got hurt because of the strategy, when maybe they didn't. Maybe they got hurt for a totally different reason, but we're going to get more buy-in to change something because they got hurt. When they're not hurt, again, and that's, I know, like the people at Altus do a great job of talking about this. They have a certain technical model in mind with sprinting, but they also allow for some kind of individual variability. So that's where like the subjective and the objective come in. What is your technical model? And like, what's the range that you think is acceptable? You still, like, I think if you're a discerning coach, will say like, okay, there's a certain range that I'm not comfortable with regardless of the output. But that's, again, what that range is can vary depending on the sport and the athlete. But that's the really hard part. Like that's where I'd have to like look at somebody and say, I don't know until I look at somebody what I'm comfortable with from like a movement bandwidth and an output standpoint.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts there? Yeah.
I think like, so much of that too is like you said, like with having a technical model. I think too many people don't have a technical model that like they either like don't have one for what they want people to be able to do, and they don't necessarily have like the principles that technical models is based off of. Because you can have a technical model that is not, it's not black and white, like it's not a fine line whether it's good or bad. It is that continuum and that spectrum like we're talking about. But you can kind of, if you understand like the principles that create that technical model, I think you have a better idea of like understanding like when is it getting kind of like too far to one end that, yeah, maybe now there's a little bit more risk than there is reward. Like that's the whole thing with like knee valgus and all that, like the things that we talked about before. It's like, yeah, some of it's fine, but like everybody knows that you don't want that knee to be like 8 inches inside of the foot medially when they're jumping and running and sprinting. It's like,
right.
But some of it's okay because there is this kind of gray area between it. But again, you have to have that technical model, I think, first to be able to make some sort of decision from. And I think you can make better decisions when you understand like the principles that actually that you base that technical model off of.
Yeah, I mean, I just took so many bullet point notes on what Doug just said because I'm thinking, like you said, Doug, I work with a lot of baseball players, and I'm thinking baseball with everything that we're talking about here, probably because I see it so much, but having that signature, your own style is such a huge thing in a sport like baseball, where the skill is more, I guess, chaotic or more dynamic. It's more individualized compared to something like sprinting, where like there generally isn't too great of a variance if you watch 7 sprinters run down the track versus 7 Major League Baseball right-handed pitchers who are similar height or similar body type. Like they're probably all throwing pretty differently in terms of like style and signature. They'll probably all do similar things well, or like hit sort of like checkpoints that you look for. But I think that's what is sometimes like really hard for me, in that, well, I definitely, I don't have the ability, you know, like an Altus coach would with a sprinter. I don't have that exact like pitching knowledge or pitching coaching capability. So I'm lucky that I have someone that I do work with closely who I can trust, who does do that stuff. So I am now a bit able to outsource that. So that's extremely helpful. And that's something that, like, as a therapist and a coach, you have to know when am I not helping this person with something that they need help with. Like I try and almost like bucket myself for the person in front of me. And it's like, is it a strength and conditioning issue? Is it a, you know, movement competency type issue where they need some sort of stretching or mobility type work with me? Is it a medical issue? Obviously continuing with me, and then potentially referring to a physician. And then on top of that, off of what we're talking about, it's like they also have to have proper coaching for the skill that they're doing. So then going back to, you know, your example of like, yeah, maybe a guy can throw 100 miles an hour, but if he's doing it improperly or less, I don't even want to use the word improper because it's such a hard thing to I don't know, like put labels on. But let's say there's mechanical flaws that most pitching coaches would agree on and say like, that's probably not good, or like a movement, you know, a rehab specialist or somebody would say like, that probably isn't so good for their shoulder or their elbow, whatever it is. Like generally speaking, like you could probably have people agree on some things that are wrong if you look at somebody pitching incorrectly, let's say. So if somebody's throwing 100 miles an hour and they're doing that, you know, once a week for 100 pitches, like all these guys coming out of the Tampa Bay Devil Rays bullpen right now are freaks. They're all like these young 20-something-year-old kids throwing 100. It's unbelievable to watch. But yeah, I mean, it makes me think, because of my bias as a rehab professional, of like, where's that going to lead down the road? And I think it's something too in like the culture of baseball, with like, to get to the show and to have a seat at the table, you kind of have to do some things that might not be the best for you, no matter how you do it. We're also like pretty privileged to be talking about this stuff, because maybe half of a roster's from the Dominican Republic, where they need to do whatever the hell they can to provide for their family. And like, they don't give a shit what we're talking about with the shoulder and the elbow. It's like, I'm going to throw the thing as hard as I can because I need to perform to get to the level to even have a conversation with someone like us, because they don't have those sorts of resources. So there's a lot of different things at play here. And then going back to also like, yeah, maybe you can throw 100 miles an hour, but when you're on my table and you can't hold yourself in quadruped, like that's a huge issue to me. Like that's a huge problem. Like you were talking about, Doug, with like in isolation, you should be able to do some things. So if you can't hold yourself in quadruped and you don't have the ability, you know, to keep your shoulder blades, your scaps up against the posterior aspect of your rib cage for longer than 15 seconds, and you can, yeah, throw 100 or bench press 405, like whatever it is, that's probably an issue for your health. And maybe you can get away with it for a while, and you probably can, but there comes a point when are we not covering all of our bases? Are we not crossing all of our T's and dotting our I's, and just telling somebody like, yeah, your output is great, so like, I don't want to touch you and I don't want to mess you up. And that's a whole nother conversation. I don't know. I feel like we have this conversation every so many months, but it's like, I feel like it's, you know, the whole do no harm. I feel like it's harmful to not intervene at some level. Right. And yeah, like I'm not a pitching coach, so yeah, you throw 100 and you have something wrong, quote unquote, with your mechanics, and you can't hold yourself in quadruped. I'm not going to tell you about your mechanics. I'm going to get you to hold yourself in quadruped, and then get somebody else to help me do the other stuff who can relate to you and coach you the way you need to be. What were you going to say, Trevor?
Yeah, like, you know, we always talk about like in our course and stuff, it's like we got to make people like humans before they're athletes, you know, especially like such a specific athlete. It's like one of the things that we do, because that's what kind of gives somebody bandwidth and gives somebody variability, like we always kind of talk about. It's like, if somebody's choosing the strategy because that's the only strategy available to them, or is that just like the strategy that they kind of choose to use? It's like Doug's example of like the like, are you using hip dominant strategy because you cannot use your quad, or are you using hip dominant strategy because like that's the best thing available to you at this kind of point in time? So I think like, again, because we do have the luxury of like getting people on a table and looking at them in so many different lenses, whether it is like from more of like the rehab centric setting where they're like passive on a table, we're looking at their joint ranges of motion, or whether we're looking at more of like, static isometric type of activities where we're just looking at controlled different joints, to then getting them up and doing faster, high speed, high velocity activities. It's like, can somebody kind of, do they have like the requisites that they need to be able to do the high intensity activity with a different strategy? Like if you don't have dorsiflexion passively, it's like, well, then I know that's going to show up when we do, different change of direction stuff, and you can't like load your ankle and load your quad. So I think it's like being able to kind of decipher, like there's kind of Sherlock Holmes is like, we're just kind of detectives trying to figure out like, well, why is this person doing what they're doing, and do they have the tools necessary to be able to possibly do it a different way? And just because they have other options doesn't mean that they have to use those options. I think it's kind of up to us to make sure like they have the ability to do them if they need to, like vertical jumping. It's like people should be able to like kind of have an ankle knee dominant strategy, and they should be able to have a hip dominant strategy. It just depends on like the timing of the jump and kind of like the constraints around like the task specifically. It's not just like jumping overall, like you always have to jump a certain way. But if like you can't use an ankle dominant strategy to really go vertical and be quick if you have zero dorsiflexion. Like that's just
now I've been, and to speak to that, I've been having, this pitching coach that I've been working with and sending people to, he's now sending people back to me because he's having kids that I haven't worked with yet come in, and it's like, and like that's all they have on a table for external rotation. It's like you can't throw effectively you can't throw for a long period of time with that range of motion. It's just not going to go well. Eventually something's going to catch up to you. So he might send somebody to me to address that thing. And it's the exact opposite with him, where like once I have that guy who is has the ability to do everything he needs to do on a table and can move dynamically on the floor, standing, whatever he needs to be able to do, then it's like, I can't help you anymore. And I'm going to be here to help manage your other parts, whatever other things you can do. And then like you need to work with your pitching coach to really get better.
Yeah, and actually, I just recorded a podcast with Jared Boyd from the Grizzlies, and we had a similar conversation and kind of talking about this idea. I think a lot of what drives this conversation is the idea of like transfer and dynamic correspondence. And I think people are so obsessed with transfer and dynamic correspondence. And when they talk about output, it's like we want to be like important and be like influence what the athlete does. So we'll try to like
that's so perfect. That like we want to be important thing is so perfect.
Right. And like, but the thing is, what can we like really, what can people like us really influence? I don't know how much, like we're not skill coaches. And even if we were, like, I don't know how much, if you're like an elite athlete, how much you're going to change what their output looks like and change the quote unquote skill or the movement pattern that they use. But what you can do is give them like the raw materials so that like whatever skill that like they're performing and whatever output you observe, they have options, and that like that whatever emerges from that takes into account those options. So we talk about like the hip strategy, with like the person changing the direction. If they have the quad strength that we would consider sufficient, whatever your kind of like metric or KPI is for quad strength, and they use hip dominant strategy, well, maybe then it's not that bad, but at least they had a choice. And from that, the hip dominant strategy still emerged. So like Greg, you talked about like the baseball player, if you don't have layback, if you don't have external rotation available to you, then your output, whatever like, idiosyncratic movement signature that you utilize is necessarily going to be impacted by your lack of options. So I think that where we can be the most effective is by giving people movement options, maybe not in a way that has complete dynamic correspondence, but the good athletes will figure that out. Like if you give, instead of saying like, okay, like we don't like the way that you throw, let's figure out like, okay, what sort of joint motions are required to throw properly throughout the kinetic chain. And we could start from the foot and go all the way up to the shoulder and to the wrist. And if anything is like really, really lacking, and we're like, wow, like this is like just super, super glaring and deficient, let's restore that in a way that isn't going to screw with their skill so much, but now they have that motion available to them. And if their strategy stays the same, maybe we shouldn't change it. But if it changes now, maybe if it changes because the athlete subconsciously is like, wow, like I have this thing available to me now I'm going to use it. So maybe we just, the fear is that we're going to like take these really good performers that have high outputs and make them worse. So maybe the strategy is not to like mess with the whole pattern, which kind of violates the idea of like trying to, have this dynamic correspondence and transfer. Maybe it's like, let's be a little bit more myopic, look at like individual joint motions and try to change those things. And that's what we can actually affect versus like trying to change a skill, which is a lot harder on like a macro level. Like maybe we get more micro and let the athlete figure it out. And then if the athlete changes the strategy, we didn't like screw them up because the athlete made the choice and it wasn't like imposed on them by somebody that's trying to be important,
That's what, like, the important thing is funny because I'm sure you guys have had it too. Like some of the player I've worked with, I have in mind with this. It's like he went to like a basketball, training facility with some PTs there in a different part of the country and came back and was like, gave me like his assessment. And it's like, it told me that like, I'm limited in this and I'm limited in that and I suck at that and I'm not good at this. And I'm like, it's like, no, dude, like, I'm not gonna lie. They're wrong. It's like, it told me my hip mobility is limited. It's like, you have 45 degrees of ER, you have 25 degrees of IR, you have plenty of hip extension, you got full hip flexion, you don't have a hip impingement, nothing pinches. It's like, your hips are fine. My thoracic spine is limited. It's like, you can rotate, you can do everything. So I think there is like, that idea of like, we do try to almost make a mountain out of a molehill with something very small like that. It's like, they don't need to be like completely perfect, but you got to have adequate ranges of motion to be able to execute things just in a decent manner. And like I said, like even like, I think those things, like the strategy things show up when you watch athletes move. Like I don't think anyone has ever seen like a really good athlete who like looks smooth and looks fluid and looks like they're just kind of in complete control and like, be like, oh, that's a really bad strategy. Like that just doesn't exist. Like they move so well, like those things aren't going to change, but it's like, it's the athletes that like, maybe they look like they have trouble getting in a position. And I think like athletes themselves, when you ask them those questions, like they know. It's like, yeah, dude, I have a hard time like going this way or doing this specific action that I need to be able to do on the court. So I think it's like asking people those questions can kind of drive our assessment and drive our intervention to help give them the appropriate things that they need to be able to do what they want to be able to do a little bit more effectively.
Yeah.
And then I like, go ahead.
Okay, Greg. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I like how you mentioned like sometimes we might need a more myopic focus and think about things like, all right, is this joint, is this muscle group, like, can we get this thing to be as robust as we can, like you said? So there could be the option to have a knee dominant strategy versus a hip dominant, but though if you don't use it, that's fine. And I feel like sometimes, I don't know, I see a lot where like people are moving so far in the opposite direction where it's like everything is about global patterns and loading global patterns and like loading the skill itself. And I know we've posted things and spoken about like training things that are as close to the skill as possible, but we're not talking about then like loading the mechanics of a delivery for a pitcher. But yeah, so I like that thought about maybe we do need to sort of rein it in and figure out like we aren't really all that important when it comes to global patterns, and we need to just focus on like, let's get this joint, let's get this muscle group to be as badass as we possibly can, because ultimately like if you're weak in a joint because you haven't worked on it and you've just worked on like these global things that may or may not transfer, like that weakness that you didn't develop and create robustness with is going to become a problem down the road.
Yeah. And Trevor talked about like a lot of athletes know, like I'm sure Greg, you've worked with pitchers where you could say like, okay, where do you miss? It's like, oh, I can't, like I can never pitch outside. And it's like, well, they have no hip internal rotation on their lead leg, right? Like I remember when I played tennis competitively, because my internal rotation on my left side sucked, I had a hard time serving out wide. So, you could tell me like, you could cue me like, hey, get your, whatever it is, like slice the ball more, toss it more outside. Like if I can't get into that lead hip, it doesn't matter. It's not like a motor learning issue per se. Like I don't have the requisite, fundamental movements to be able to do that task in a global way.
I think you're thinking pretty highly of my athletes that I'm working with.
Well, some of the pro guys tend to know. Maybe
yeah. No, I agree. The higher level guys will be able to come and say like, I've realized that I need to change my foot position on a certain pitch to hit a certain location in the strike zone. I've heard that from people before, but yeah, those are definitely not the majority of the kids I'm working with. oftentimes, and I know I was the same way when I was their age, like oftentimes it's just like, I can't throw a damn strike period, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, no,
yeah.
I totally agree. And then, some of the kids who, and I don't even want to say kids, but like, these athletes, as they get a little bit older, they play a little bit longer, and they start to hear and like see what other people are doing, either at the gym or at a pitching coach where there's a bunch of other athletes around. Like, they almost just need to sort of be shown that, like, or be told that somebody else has something that they can feel, and then it's like, oh, that's what this thing is. It's like they don't even realize until they're being told by somebody else that there is this thing within them that they can sense and feel that they can't hit the outside corner, like you said. So, yeah, that's enough of that.
Yeah, and it's not. I mean, sometimes like where it gets tricky, you can have somebody that looks just a fluent mover, looks exquisite, but then like what if they're always hurt? Like they look the part, right? But let's say it's like somebody that when they jump, you're just like, wow, this is poetry in motion. But then they've got like chronic patellar tendinopathy. Is it because they're not like their output strategy is flawed, or maybe it's just because they don't have the load tolerance capability like in their quads? Like maybe like just getting more quad strength, and for that athlete, maybe just doing like some leg extensions using a variety of loading patterns, whether it's like isometric, concentric, eccentric, a variety of rep ranges to kind of condition that tendon. Maybe for them, like that is actually the best way to kind of improve their skill and not mess with what their output looks like. But then you could have someone, who you would consider like a very idiosyncratic mover, but like if they're never hurt, and they have a high output, and they if you really break down your technical model and they still adhere to it, but they've got like a little bit of like a hitch somewhere or like an idiosyncrasy, then you don't like why change it. So sometimes people who look good, they do require an intervention, but it's not because necessarily like the strategy has to change. It's because like maybe they need to build up their currency in the raw materials, whether it's like maybe it's fatigue resistance. Maybe like they have, when you test them in a less fatigued state, they look the way you want them to look, but then when they're fatigued, that pattern changes. So it's not so much like the strategy per se as like they can't resist fatigue very well. So sometimes like doing something that looks nothing like the sport could be the answer to making that output look better, if you think that even the way that the output looks is the problem. But it's not always about looks. Like that's why there's so many variables. But I think that you have to have a technical model. The technical model should account for like a range of acceptable, because not everything is good. Like some strategies are better than others, even though a lot of strategies can work. And you've got to figure out like, account for all these variables and figure out when you need to intervene, because people can overly intervene, which is bad. Like now you're tinkering with something that's not broken. But it's also like, why are you a coach if anytime you see something that looks good, you would never even like investigate
Right.
deeper and try to find more solutions? So it's
Yeah.
where it's
Yeah,
interesting.
and I know you had mentioned to us before we started recording about how you just recorded with Dr. Jared Boyd from the Grizzlies, like you said, and how you kind of dove into some stuff with him that's like may otherwise be seemed as like meathead-ish, right? Where you're doing some things that are like isolating joints and just kind of moving some weight around, and where like maybe 2 years ago we might have been like, oh, whoa, what is that? Like that's not athletic performance training, you know what I mean? And I'm now like in my head going back to things like I'm toying with like battle ropes for my pitchers, and like why wouldn't I do things like that where I care more about the forces that are going on and like the dynamic action that's going on, if it's like a plyo or ballistic or eccentric, concentric, like I care more about the forces and those types of things than what the actual drill is. And to me, it's also like, let's keep it real, right? If you're just going to do banded shoulder internal rotation at any angle, like you can't tell me that the forces going on there are going to be better than if I'm doing a battle rope and shaking something fast for 10 seconds or whatever it is. So that's why I'm sort of toying with things that I otherwise would have been like, what the hell is this person doing with their baseball player? That's not a baseball thing. It's just like not culturally accepted at this point. And so that's been pretty fun. And I want to do a lot more stuff with people's hands on the ground. But yeah, I think it's like I said, just looking at what are the forces going on and what's the goal. And it's always going back to like, what are the forces that are happening?
I think we're going to see a resurgence of bodybuilding style training in sports, especially among
I
people who are
hope
very
so. I
athletically
hope
gifted.
so.
Because like some of these guys who have like 40-inch, like the guys you see in the dunk contest that have like 40-inch vertical leaps and can do 360s and jump over cars, like should our training or our work with them be devoted to like making them more athletic? Like how much more athletic are we going to make them, or making them just available to play, right? So and then also like the sport, and this is a point Jared made, like their sports have such a high cognitive demand because of like the tactics and the strategy involved. Like why would we do things in the weight room that have a high, not that like they're overwhelmed necessarily, but like why would you spend something that takes more than like a minute to demonstrate with an athlete who like is playing a game that's very technically complex anyway? Because that's where they should be focused on. So I think how you would train like a developmental, like a high school athlete who maybe isn't that gifted, like if we talk about like, and even Jared brought up like efficiency, like what does efficiency really mean? He kind of defined it as like a sort of risk reward type thing. If you have somebody that like without really aggressive, so to speak, training would never like, qualify to play college sports, you're going to train them differently than like somebody who has a 40-inch vertical leap and is making like $20 million a year in the NBA. Like we can't pretend that like those stakes and like what's at stake if we screw up isn't going to influence our training. So there's much more downside to doing the wrong thing with that like NBA $20 million athlete who can already 360 dunk over a car. Like again, if we add like an inch to their vertical leap, are you really going to notice that? Versus like if we hurt them in training, we're definitely going to notice that. So I think for like the really high skilled people, like they have something that we can't teach them. We need them to be available. And so that's why I think that like just some like isolating muscles, so to speak, and just like trying to load where we want to load and kind of develop this load tolerance. These athletes can demonstrate the skill they already have on the court. I think that like for some of these really highly skilled athletes, the further away from dynamic correspondence we can go, sometimes the better. And I think that like you're going to see forward-thinking teams doing more like bodybuilding type training, and you're going to see weight rooms now like have more machines, because we talked about with Jared like the whole just load it thing, which I think is kind of like a, it's not a comprehensive type of strategy. You're saying like, okay, just load it. Like, what are you trying to load? And when you have these complex global movement patterns, it's very hard with all those degrees of freedom to control the load for where you want it. Whereas with like more bodybuilding type single joint training, now you're like, okay, like here's what I actually want to load, and you can be much more strategic about what you're loading. And that to me is like makes more sense, and it's a more comprehensive strategy than saying like just load anything, because like especially at the pro level and the elite level, just load it sort of suggests that these athletes are underloaded. I don't think it like somebody in the NBA who has a chronic tendinopathy is underloaded. Like they're probably overloaded. So now like where do you want to concentrate the load in training to make them more robust? And that's where I think like having simplified single joint type training can be very, very effective. So I think we're going to see more of that actually. And to me, like, again, we talked about 2 or 3 years ago, we probably would have dismissed that as like, it's not functional. Right. But now I think it makes like a ton of sense. I think we're going to see more of it.
I mean, I think that idea right there is exactly what you said a couple of weeks ago about like, it's like with like the question about like push-ups. It's like you got to like move the floor and move the ceiling. You have to create bandwidth. And I think when you, especially like super high level athletes, when we're talking about like like the pro basketball players that this example is, where they're doing like their sport is so explosive and so fast and so demanding, and this like kind of one end of the continuum of like certain qualities. It's like to give them bandwidth, you have to change it up. Like it's like they're not talking about doing more plyometrics to cure that tendinopathy. It's like they're getting enough jumps and enough high intensity accelerations and decelerations and change of directions in their sport that you have to give them something else on the other side of the continuum, which is like that low load, long duration, type of isometrics or eccentrics or whatever it is, just kind of getting that time under tension that's going to put stress in the places that we want.
Yeah, and you have to look at the individual needs of each sport too. Oops, I got a little caravan going by here, real-time podcasting in New York City. Like I would imagine that the strength norms in the NBA are much different than they are in the NFL, right? So Rob Panarello, remember we went to that course with him a few years ago. Like he talked about like, okay, at the Division III level in football, Division II and Division I, like here's fire truck going by. Here's the average of like what people can do. So he's not even saying like, you have to be exceptional, but like if you're rehabbing somebody, you have to get them back from an output standpoint to like the baseline level of like what people can typically do in that sport. Because if you can't like, if you're an NFL like linebacker, right? And if the average back squat for that position is like, let's say like 500 pounds, if you have like a 300-pound squat, you better be like exceptionally skilled, right? So having a high output allows you to actually be less skilled, but you want to have both, right? Because and then being less skilled allows you to have like a lower output. So, but the part that we can actually control, I think, is really more of the output. So as long as we're developing output and we're actually not trying to make it too specific and too dynamically correspondent and screwing with what they do from like a technical standpoint, then they have the output. Now they can choose to use it or not.
Yeah, but I think that's why like I like Greg's example about like the pitching thing. It's like just because we're trying to get things like, to quote unquote transfer, it's like that doesn't mean that we're like loading sport specific patterns. Like you're not like loading somebody's jump shot with a 20-pound medicine ball. You're not loading somebody's throwing with a 5-pound, weighted ball. It's like that's where I think it's like things get taken too far versus what Greg had mentioned before. It's like, no, we're trying to like give people the appropriate forces for whatever their needs are. And like I said, like the population and the age and the sport, all those factors kind of come into play in terms of like they come into play if we understand how those things interact to give the athlete in front of us like one of the best interventions kind of for them that help meet their needs.
Awesome. I think we kind of took that on a nice little tangent there and beat that up a little bit. So we'll end it here and then we'll take some questions. Did you have something, Doug?
No, I was gonna say that we kind of like didn't really answer. We just because it's a hard thing to answer, but hopefully there's something in there that's usable.
Something valuable, hopefully. Yeah. But thanks for listening, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
As a thank you for listening, we'd like to offer a 10% discount on all products at resilientperformance.com. Please use promo code PODCAST at checkout. That's PODCAST. And I also encourage you to sign up for our mailing list to receive exclusive articles only available by signing up. Thanks for listening.